Hello, my name is Alyna Williams, and my presentation is on diffusion. To begin, diffusion is due to the constant movement of atoms, whether it be stationary vibrating in solids or free movement of gases, and the occurrence of a concentration gradient, where there is an imbalance of concentration in two areas. Atoms will move from higher concentrated areas to low concentrations, such as in alloys with inner diffusion. The atoms and elements will also diffuse in themselves through self-diffusion. The relationship of temperature and the rate of diffusion is directly proportional. As temperature increases, energy of atoms and movement increases as well, causing more vacancies and bond breakage, and therefore increasing the rate of diffusion. Having empty sites for atoms to diffuse into, and having enough activation energy from the thermal vibration of atoms to break and form new bonds is required for diffusion and atom movement. Vacancy and interstitial diffusion are two models or mechanisms to represent this. Vacancy diffusion relies on the presence of a vacant adjacent site, as the name suggests. It also applies to substitutional impurity atoms. Interstitial diffusion involves smaller atoms that diffuse between other larger atoms and occurs at a more rapid rate than vacancy diffusion. There are several other factors besides temperature that influence the rate of diffusion. These include bonding types, atom size, and crystal structure. As compared to materials that have covalent or ionic bonding, diffusion rate is increased in materials with secondary bonding. Secondary bonding includes van der Waals forces, dipole-dipole forces, and hydrogen bonding. Next, the rate of diffusion increases for atoms that are smaller. Lastly, as compared to a closely packed structure, diffusion rate is faster for open crystal structures. My 3D model represents interdiffusion, which, as just explained, the atoms will migrate from one metal to the other. My model is overall very simplistic, and I based it off the textbook example of a copper and nickel alloy. It shows the natural state of the atoms, and then it shows a mixture of the atoms after interdiffusion due to an intense heat treatment. This is an experimental representation of diffusion. Again, I went with a very simplistic design, demonstrating food coloring diffusing in water of different temperatures. I used two different dye colors, blue for the warm water and purple for the cold water. While the condensation on the cold water cup made it a bit harder to see, the purple dye just spreads to the bottom, while the blue dye in the warm water spreads throughout rather quickly. When applying mathematical concepts for diffusion, it is important to remember that it is a time-dependent process. We name the rate of diffusion, or mass transfer, as the diffusion flux labeled as J. However, diffusion flux does not always change with time, as explained by Fick's laws. Fick's first law relates to steady-state diffusion that is independent of time. Regardless of how long the diffusion takes, the flux will be unaffected. Comparatively, the second law is related to non-steady-state diffusion, where the rate does change based on time and is time-dependent. The first equation shown for the second law is the partial differential equation, but the second equation shows the simplified version for calculations. This equation shows the relationship between concentration, position, and time. Why does diffusion matter? Diffusion can be applied to all areas of life. Spraying cologne or perfume causes the scent to diffuse through the air and allows you to smell it. Similar to the food coloring demonstration, dipping a tea bag in a cup of hot water allows the tea to move from the highly concentrated bag to the low concentrated water until evenly saturated. In biology, both animals and plants have mechanisms that allow movement and diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide through the body. Cells have selectively permeable membranes that allow specific transport of materials. They also have natural concentration gradients, and moving with the gradient is a form of passive transport or diffusion. Oxygen and carbon dioxide can move freely, but some materials require proteins to assist in diffusing through the membrane, which is called facilitated diffusion. Glucose is an example of this because it relies on carrier proteins. While both diffusion and osmosis are passive transport, osmosis only deals with liquid, and in the case of a cell, it is only with water. In engineering, diffusion has a broad spectrum of applications. Diffusion can be used in semiconductors, welding, and other forms of metal bonding, nuclear waste, carburizing, case hardening, and more. For example, in case hardening or interchangeably carburizing, diffusion of stronger alloys on a material's surface allows for strengthening due to a new outer layer, such as diffusing carbon atoms over iron to harden it. In the example of welding by diffusion, time, temperature, and pressure are key elements. Through solid-state diffusion, two smooth surfaces are placed together at controlled pressure and temperature to allow for diffusion through deformation and manipulating grain boundaries. Thank you for listening to my presentation. These were my sources used.